And so what happens is that I won't go through the whole founding of the Asia Society, but 1956, he then finally founds the Asia Society right after resuscitating the Japan Society after World War II. And he begins to think in more earnest about building a collection. And he's very clear that building a collection should not replicate what the Metropolitan has or what Brooklyn had. He was very interested in creating a collection that was unique, that would suit his taste, with always the intent to give it away. And this starts in earnest in early 1960s. Before that, he's had some pieces, but it's really in the early 1960s. And first thing he does, as he did with his first strip in 1929, is to say, okay, who's the best person who is known as a great curator, great leader, great connoisseur? And at that time, that was Sherman Lee. So he approaches Sherman Lee, who was already the head of the Museum Gallery Advisory Committee. And he invites Sherman to come to his house and says, I want to talk to you. Now, by this time, Sherman is already the chief curator of Asian art and soon to become the director of the Cleveland Museum of Art. So Sherman actually kind of talks about this in his memoir, where he says, I know you want me to do this, to be your advisor, but I have to tell you, there's a very distinct, clear possibility of conflict of interest, because I'm the chief curator of Oriental Art for the Cleveland Museum of Art. Mind you, in those days, everybody called it Oriental Art. We don't do that anymore. And then Sherman goes on to say, well, I said we have to work this out. And I would clearly have to get the permission and the approval of the Board of Trustees of the Cleveland Museum of Art if I were to do this. And then he goes on to talk about how they worked out a system, which they completely followed when they finally went into operation. That if something was first offered to JDR III, he had the first right of refusal. But if Sherman saw it first, he had to first take it to the Cleveland Museum. Cleveland Museum had the first right of refusal. And Sherman is now quoted, but I remember asking him when I heard this, and I said to Sherman, well, what if you're together? And he said, we thought about that. So he said, if we saw it together, it had to be a flip of a coin. And whoever won, that was it. And Sherman goes on to talk about the fact that it was only once that they were in that situation. And in that situation, Cleveland won out. I actually want to know which piece it was, but he doesn't tell us that. The other thing that I think is very, very interesting is that Cleveland Museum would have agreed at all. In today's time, this would not be so easy, actually. And Sherman goes on to talk about the chairman of the board, and actually the chairman of the board thought this was a good idea. And the reason why they thought it was a good idea is because Cleveland had a very large acquisition fund. And so the chairman of the board says, okay, between us and the Rockefellers, we would have it covered. The best piece will either come to us or to you, and we would be in good company. So they literally had this idea that they would dominate the market. And that's what they proceeded to do. The best pieces in the 60s, surprisingly, were not going to the Metropolitan Museum, not to Boston Museum, but to Cleveland Museum and right here at at that point, the JDR III collection.